I've been painting loads of my Cryptcast Infernal Army recently, spending around an hour per mini. And while I'm truly enjoying the process, it led me to thinking of ways to paint much quicker. In particular, considering processes that would be fast, but still fun and feel like me. And ultimately, still look good. Around this time, I was in my friendly local game store, tripped, and somehow ended up with this Sylvanus spearhead. Yep, that's how it happened. Definitely. Regardless, these Kurnoth Hunters seemed like great minis to work out the theory I had creeping around in the back of my mind. The paint scheme I had in mind for these dudes was kind of post-forest fire, winter. This meant all the various leaves and anything living needed to go. Never be afraid to modify your minis to best suit your purposes. You don't need to glue on every little bauble and gubbin, regardless of what's in the instructions. And cut things off if you don't want to see or paint them. They are your models. Make them your own. With these fellas built and primed, it was time to hose them down with the perfect base coat for burnt bark. Yeah, you guessed it, deep magenta. Maybe a bit of a wild starting point, but I promise it will all make sense at the end. Probably. Here's where the fast painting begins. In order to significantly increase the painting speed, I opted for the dry brush and began with neutral gray. Now, despite the name, you really don't want your brush to be, well, dry. Think of a brush, any brush, as the transport vehicle we use to transfer paint from one place to where we actually want it. Like from the palette to the model. We don't want the paint to stay on the brush, and moisture helps bristles shed paint. However, we don't want a lot of water on the dry brush either. Very little, in fact. To do this, I'll get a damp piece of paper towel and dab the brush onto it. There are more expensive tools to do this, of course, but this is what I've got. Then I'll load a small amount of paint onto the brush from my dry brush palette, a cheap dollar store vinyl cutting board that I primed, and work most of the paint off on the same palette. Then I'll test it on the back of my hand before touching the model. As the first layer, neutral gray was put on fairly heavily, just leaving the dark magenta in the recesses and some lower areas light wouldn't reach. If the brush can't reach it, then it's in shadow. I wasn't too concerned about it. Next, I grabbed bright neutral gray and focused on the upper facing surfaces and the face, primarily using top to bottom brushstrokes, helping to bring attention towards the face and giving the model an overall sense of light direction. Finally, I gently added some white to the face and central areas of the mini. Through all the dry brushing, I did my best to avoid the weapons, but I wasn't too concerned if they got some of the gray on them. If, for some reason, you're not already following Artis Opus, I'll link them in the description. Byron is an absolute wizard with the dry brush, and I'd highly recommend heading over there to learn. The bark was looking pretty good. There was some decent highlighting, and I liked the magenta shadows. However, I wanted them to look a bit more torched and charred. Enter in black wash, stage left. Using a large brush, I loaded it up with the wash and began slopping the wash all over the dry brushed areas, again avoiding the weapons. This would help darken everything down while maintaining some of the purple, particularly in the shaded areas. Once it was dry, a little more brightness was needed around the face and upper portion of these trees. Once again, grabbing the dry brush, I gently brushed on some white. For this paint scheme to really work, I needed to have a nice pop of color somewhere. Specifically, these dudes' weapons. To contrast the deep magenta shadows, I opted for a bright jade. For the initial layer, I mixed in a little of the deep magenta into the bright jade and started sketching on some lines of paint. I was not at all precise here, leaving quite a bit of the magenta showing through in the shadows and recesses. My goal was to add some visual interest and maximize the impact with very little time or effort. I then moved to straight bright jade, building up the highlights and volumes. These sharp changes in tone are abundantly clear when viewed up close, but not when viewed at arm's length or on the tabletop. Again, this is all about visual impact with little effort. Finally, some sparing highlights were added with ghost green. Somewhere along this process, I decided I was having way too much fun painting trees, and things sort of got out of control. Now, the brushwork added a bit more time, maybe 10 minutes per mini, but I think the contrast is quite striking and looks great on the table. Having a bunch of minis to base is just more efficient. That's what we're going with, at least. Once again, with max impact front of mind, I quickly overbrushed on some glacier blue, adding some contrast to the base. Then slopped on some brown wash, giving the base an eerie, grungy, purple, gray, brown vibe. After gluing on a few tufts, the final piece of the post-forest fire winter needed to be snow. I've used this snow flocking from the Army Painter before, and while there are a few ways to apply it, this is my favorite. I'll pour some into a container. Obviously, I'm using these little red cups that I use for pretty well everything. Then I'll dump in some PVA glue and mix it up. I don't have an exact ratio that I aim for, just looking for a consistency that vaguely looks crystalline still, but settles quite smooth. Then I scooped it out and began adding it to the bases. I decided that these angry trees needed some of the snow on them as well, so I smushed some on where it seemed to make sense to my smooth brain. Then a few victory laps of black around the base rims, and we've got these three dudes, and all of their friends, done. Well, there you go, a massive pile of angry trees. All painted in about 10 hours. I'm quite happy with how this quick and easy paint job turned out, and I think they look pretty decent, particularly on the tabletop. Dry brushing can sometimes be labeled as a beginner technique. However, like any other skill, it can be leveled up. And if you're looking to paint a pile of plastic pretty quickly, it's real hard to beat. Let me know what you think about these tree dudes. Are you a dry brush enthusiast already? Or are you now keen to incorporate it into your own process? Let me know in the comments below. Most importantly, thanks for watching. You are awesome.